Nobody knows what happens to people when their heart stops. This doctor knows. He was there. And what he described, medicine has never been able to explain. Rajiv Party spent more than 25 years in operating rooms, not as a patient. As chief anesthesiologist at a major cardiac clinic in Bakersfield, California. His job came down to one thing. He turned off people's consciousness. Professionally, precisely, down to the milligram. He administered the drug, watched the person disappear into darkness, and knew exactly when they would come back. This was not a metaphor or a philosophy. It was chemistry. Consciousness equals a functioning brain. A functioning brain equals a living body. Remove one, everything vanishes. For 25 years, that formula never failed. When patients woke up and started describing things they saw out there, in the darkness, Party listened politely. Nodded. Sometimes suggested they see a psychiatrist. Not out of cruelty. He simply understood how the brain behaves under critical stress, and stories about light at the end of a tunnel seemed to him about as credible as dreams about flying elephants. Christmas 2010 changed that forever. By that point, Party had been fighting prostate cancer for 2 years. Surgery to treat the cancer caused complications. The complications required another surgery. That one caused new complications. By December 2010, his body was so worn down that another surgical crisis turned into sepsis, a life-threatening blood infection, requiring emergency intervention on Christmas Eve at the UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles, one of the best hospitals in the country. Party, a man who had spent his entire career standing on the other side of the operating table, lay down on it himself. They administered anesthesia. His body switched off. His consciousness did not. The first thing he registered was the ceiling. Not in the ordinary sense, not the way a person looks up while lying down. He was seeing the operating room from above, from roughly 3 meters up, and he could see his own body below. Surgeons were making an incision. The smell of infection rising from the wound was so intense that nurses began applying eucalyptus-scented water to the surgical masks so the team could keep working. Party saw this, smelled it, and heard the anesthesiologist telling colleagues a joke. A fairly crude one, by Party's own account. He blushed when he repeated it in the recovery room. This is where it is worth stopping, because this is not a sensation, not a dream image. This is a specific, verifiable fact. The anesthesiologist confirmed the joke. The nurses confirmed the eucalyptus water. This is what the medical literature calls a verified out-of-body experience, not in the mystical literature but in the medical one, because such cases cannot be explained by the standard model of how consciousness works. A patient under full anesthesia, with compromised vital signs, perceives specific details of a real event. The explanation official medicine offers in such cases is always the same: light anesthesia. The patient was not sufficiently under and partially heard what was happening. It sounds reasonable. There is one problem. At the same time as the operating room in Los Angeles, Party found himself in a kitchen in New Delhi, India, his mother's home, thousands of kilometers from the operating table. He saw his mother and sister talking, preparing for dinner. His mother was wearing a green sari. His sister was in blue jeans and a red shirt. He tried to get their attention, called out to them. They did not hear him, did not see him. 2 days later, he called his mother and described the scene, including what they were wearing. She confirmed it. Both of them were home. Both dressed exactly as he described, at exactly that time. Light anesthesia does not explain New Delhi. And this is where the picture starts to break apart in a serious way. Because this is no longer about a hallucination from someone half hearing things through the drugs. This is about perceiving specific details in 2 locations simultaneously, with both locations confirmed by independent witnesses. For neuroscience, this is not merely an inconvenient case. It is a structural problem. A brain deprived of adequate oxygen should not be generating a coherent picture of reality in two separate places at once. It should not be generating anything at all. But the operating room and New Delhi were only the beginning. Then came the darkness. Party described it not as a room with the lights off, more like the absence of everything, inside which something was nonetheless present. He felt something approaching, did not see it, did not hear it. Felt it, and that feeling was worse than any fear he had known before. A man who had watched hundreds of patients in critical condition, who had long since made his peace with the fact that people leave, suddenly found himself in a situation where all his professional experience offered not a single tool for understanding what was happening. Then there was fire, not a metaphor. He described it as a chasm filled with fire, real, with heat, with smell, with figures inside it. He spoke about the figures reluctantly and in few words, but one detail he repeated in every interview. This place looked nothing like what his patients had described to him. No light, no peace, no gentle, welcoming presence. It was a place which he, a man who had spent his life in skepticism, recognized instantly and without doubt. And then a voice told him something. You have never loved anyone. Not as an accusation, more like a diagnosis, calm and precise. And Party, standing at the edge of that chasm, began reviewing his life and found he had nothing to argue with. Not because he was a bad person in the conventional sense, he had not hurt his children or deceived his partners. It was simply that all his life he had stood at the center of his own universe. The mansion in Bakersfield, several expensive cars, the title of chief anesthesiologist, money as the measure of success and the purpose of existence, patients as working material, not as people, family as background noise. He had spent his life in operating rooms, ensuring others felt no pain, while never once asking himself when someone had last felt genuinely good in his presence. Understanding his own failures turned out to be worse than the fire, and at that moment his father appeared. This is an important detail that is easy to miss. Party's father had been a hard man. By Rajiv's own account, he had feared him as a child. Not respected him, not admired him, feared him. So when he saw his father there, the first reaction was shock, not relief. The last person he expected to find in the place where he had ended up. But the man he saw was not the father from his childhood. Before him stood a quiet man, without anger, without judgment, without anything in his eyes that Rajiv had spent his whole life bracing for. Only understanding. His father took his hand and led him away from the edge. And Party followed, because there was no other option, and because for the first time in his life, he felt no fear standing next to his father. Then there was a tunnel, deceased relatives, a being he described as angelic, and a conversation after which he was told that the time had not yet come, that he needed to return, that the life ahead of him was not simply a continuation, but an opportunity to correct what had been done wrong. The doctors brought him back. Within 72 hours of the surgery, his dependence on painkillers, accumulated over 2 years of illness, was gone. The chronic pain disappeared, the depression lifted. He spoke about this afterward with undisguised astonishment, because as a physician, he understood that this is not how it works. Opioid dependence does not resolve in 3 days. Chronic post-surgical pain does not evaporate on its own. But it did. Over the following months, Party gave away the mansion, sold the cars, left the chief anesthesiologist position he had built over 20 years, opened a small clinic focused on working with consciousness rather than the body, wrote a book, began speaking with his family in ways he never had before. His colleagues decided he had lost his mind. That is an understandable reaction. A man with a brilliant career, stable income, and a clear future suddenly abandons everything and starts telling people he visited hell and came back. From the perspective of a rational observer, this looks exactly like psychosis, or, at the very least, a severe existential crisis following serious illness. Medicine preferred the light anesthesia version and left it at that. But there is a study that does not support that version. In 2008, Dr. Sam Parnia, a British-American critical care physician and researcher at Stony Brook University in New York, launched the largest scientific study of consciousness during cardiac arrest in history. It was called AWARE, which stands for Awareness During Resuscitation. 4 years, 15 hospitals across the world, 2,060 documented cases of cardiac arrest with surviving patients. Not a mystical project, a rigorous scientific study with control groups, precise timing, and verified data. The results were uncomfortable. 39% of survivors reported some form of awareness during the period when their heart was not beating. Nearly half of those who completed a full interview described experiences that did not fit the standard clinical definition. Among the descriptions, one detail kept recurring, which Parnia highlighted separately. People underwent what he called a moral review of their entire lives. Not individual moments, not highlights. Their entire lives, with a clear understanding of how they had behaved toward others. The overlap with what Party described is precise enough that coincidence becomes a difficult position to hold. One case in the study was verified chronometrically. A patient during cardiac arrest accurately reproduced audio signals that had been played through headphones in the operating room. The signals were synchronized with a timer, which means researchers knew the exact moment when a patient, with a stopped heart and no oxygen reaching the brain, perceived external information and retained it. The official conclusion of the study was careful. Parnia wrote that consciousness and awareness appear to be capable of existing during the period when the heart is not beating. Not a statement. The cautious phrasing of a scientist who understands that the data exists, but the explanation does not. The medical community received this calmly, debated it mildly in journals, and continued operating on the previous model, because the previous model works for 98% of cases, and for the remaining 2, there is always a simpler explanation available. There is a version that explains this differently. It has no scientific evidence base, and that is important to state clearly. But it exists, has existed for some time, and is held by people who have no connection to mysticism or religion. The version is this: consciousness is not produced by the brain. The brain receives it, the way an antenna receives a signal. When the brain shuts down, the antenna stops working, but the signal keeps going. And in that brief period before the connection is finally severed, consciousness exists independently, perceives information from multiple sources simultaneously, and sees what it sees. An operating room in Los Angeles, a kitchen in New Delhi, a fiery chasm, a father with no anger in his eyes. This version explains Party's case better than light anesthesia. It explains nothing else. Not why some people see light and others see darkness. Not why one person finds himself above the operating table while another travels somewhere else entirely. Not why some return with nothing and others come back feeling they understood something essential. Rajiv Party returned with a specific piece of knowledge, not about the structure of the universe, not about what comes after, about how he had lived. And that knowledge cost him his career, his home, and everything he had taken to be himself. He said in interviews, "You do not need the experience of a stopped heart to change." But that was exactly what he needed. Because for 25 years he had been switching off other people's consciousness and was absolutely certain he understood how it worked. It turned out he understood nothing.